Good evening, everyone. We are just going to give everybody a minute to get into our meeting tonight, and then we'll get started.
Okay, hold on. Wait, hold on for a moment. That was funny. Okay, hold on. Yes, one more. Wow, that was exciting. Okay, good. For fans of Harold Lloyd, I hit the wrong button on my chair. So I'm glad there's a recording of that. That's good.
All right, well, we'll get started for this evening. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Hudson Library for our virtual author event with New York Times bestselling author David Lipsky. He
And
is
also,
joining us.
and chair non-enthusiast David Lipsky.
He
Chair
is joining us.
experimenter.
He's joining us tonight for a conversation about his new book, The Parrot in the Igloo, Climate and the Science of Denial. Before our conversation tonight, I just want to take a moment and talk about some of the upcoming programs we have going on at the library, because our fall schedule is full and we are excited to have the month of September. We're doing a tour of Spain. So many of our adult programs will feature the culture, language, art, music. We even have some virtual tours scheduled of different Spain destinations in Spain. So you don't want to miss out on those programs. You can check out all of our upcoming programs at hudsonlibrary.org, register online as well. Right now, we are doing both in-person and some virtual programs. So just make sure when you register, you know whether it is in the building or just on Zoom like we're doing right now. Well, allow me to please introduce our author this evening. David Lipsky is the author of the New York Times bestsellers, Absolutely American, and Although, of course, you end up becoming yourself. He's written for the New York Times, The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, and Harper's Magazine. He's a recipient of the National Magazine Award, and his work has been collected in the Best American Short Stories and the Best American Magazine Writing. He teaches writing and literature at New York University. We have copies of The Parrot in the Igloo available for purchase courtesy of the Learned Owl Bookshop in Hudson. If you would like to purchase your copy, we will have a link in the chat. You can just click on the link right there and purchase your copy this evening. So David, thank you so much for your time. We certainly look forward to hearing more about your new book.
It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So we'll kind of jump right in. I have some questions for you. And of course, we love to hear questions from our audience. We'll take questions. You can ask your question at any time during the or during our presentation using the Q&A, but we'll take questions after our conversation tonight. So please feel free to put your question in at any time. So I read in the epilogue of your book that you were actually working on a different book when this one quote, as you said, made you stop and write it. What kind of compelled you to begin writing this book?
I was shocked, and I imagine you were shocked too, to see just how big a head start we had on this issue. I think there were two things. One was in the 1950s and one was at the end of the 1970s. I was shocked to see that someone who became the first great American climate scientist, an ocean-going man named Roger Revelle, who had done great stuff in the Navy and in the Bureau of Ships. He was in Time magazine in May of 1956, and he just said, in 50 years or so, this may have a violent effect on the climate, and then defined pretty much everything that we know about the carbon dioxide effect, the greenhouse effect. We haven't learned that much more since, including things like feedbacks. And that really shocked me because that's not like an underground publication or a science publication. It's just Time magazine. And then I thought, okay, it's like everyone strikes out when they're playing softball. You swing and you miss. And then in the late 70s, as I was doing more research, there were a bunch of reports that came all together. And so the White House turned to our National Academy of Sciences and said, is this going to happen? Please review all the reports we've had since the 50s. And there was a panel of fresh eyes, not people who've been writing those reports for 2 decades. And they met. They were like the jury that returns a quick verdict. And they said, this will be reassuring to scientists, our report, but disturbing to policymakers. if the carbon dioxide release continues, this panel sees no reason to believe that climate changes won't occur and no reason to believe those changes will be negligible. And then the fact that nobody did anything made me think that I had to climb up to a roof and start talking about it in a loud voice.
How long did it take you to put your research and all that together to write the book?
It was a very long process. I mean, as you know, there are great stories throughout both the 70 years that we've been dealing with climate change here, and then about the century and a half before then. So longer than I'd like to say.
Okay, well, since your book just came out in July, there's probably some viewers tonight that haven't had a chance to read the book. Can you kind of give us an overview? I know it's like 400 pages, so it's hard to give an overview of it, or at least what do you hope your readers will take away from your book?
Alice, it's 470 pages.
Almost 500. Okay, thank you.
It's a great story. It's a great story. So the main thing that I wanted from the book is that it's the issue that people try to, Allison, have you seen the movie Inception, that Leonardo DiCaprio movie?
No, I haven't. I've heard of it. I have not seen it.
A team of people, they try to get into your dreams and they try to give you opinions that aren't really yours. And that's what politics has become a lot. Politics reach maturity. It's our bad luck around the same time that the research for climate change did. And people got great at inserting opinions that we believe are ours, but aren't ours. For example, do you have friends who don't believe in this issue?
Sure.
And one of the things they'll say is, why do they keep changing the name? Like for a while it was global warming and now it's climate change. If it was real, they wouldn't keep changing the name. Have you? I hear that one a lot. Have you ever heard that one?
I mean, I recall reading in your book that I don't remember the person it was,
don't
but
ruin
someone changed it because they thought it was too.
Yeah, it had catastrophic connotations.
Yes.
Yeah,
I don't recall the person, but
but that's the kind of stuff that let me explain to people who haven't had a chance to go to the Learned Owl and pick the book up yet. By the turn of the century, there were no scientists who didn't believe that it was in process or that it was going to be increasingly difficult to deal with as we waited, but there were good profit-taking and profit-making reasons to delay. And some of those people were funding, for better or worse, Republican candidates. And so a man named Frank Luntz, who the New York Times said the Republican Party treats the way King Arthur treated Merlin, like the wizard who can get you the things that you can't get otherwise. They turned to him to come up with a solution. And one of his solutions in 2002 was, we need to stop using the phrase global warming and start using the phrase climate change, because global warming has catastrophic connotations. That was the phrase that Allison did me the honor of remembering. Whereas climate change sounds like you're just going from Ohio. He used the state for the Hudson Library. Maybe he knows the library. But he said that it sounds like you're going from Ohio to Fort Lauderdale. And so we will do better if we are very careful to start using a different phrase for it. And that's the kind of thing where you walk around thinking that's your opinion, but it's like a pre-made opinion that someone slipped into your pocket when you were in the airport. And so I wanted the book to be something you could keep in your pocket. It happens to be a great story. So you were talking about how I teach in the creative writing program at NYU. I teach storytelling. And I thought, okay, the best protection that people have and that we have as we try to solve this problem would be telling the story in a way that's as good as Gone Girl or as good as Little Fires Everywhere, but that would fill people with the real story, so that when someone tried to walk around, the next Frank Luntz, the next Merlin, who tries to slip a bad opinion into your pocket, you're like, no, I've got the real stuff in here already. Go try to get somebody else.
So your book is divided into 3 parts: the inventors, the scientists, and the deniers. And I like how you summarized it. You said it was the people who made our world, then the people who realized there might be a problem, then the people who lied about the problem. For you, what was the most intriguing part to research?
What's your guess, Allison?
The deniers.
The deniers. Yeah, that was the thing that took the most time too, because they were so crazy. Um, but yeah, the deniers, uh, they are they're not distinguished. I mean, did they strike you as the most distinguished set of scientists? I mean, a lot of them aren't scientists.
Right, right. That's a good point.
There was one of them. Uh, there was one a man named Christopher Monckton who, before he decided to try to make his name in climate science, had tried to become politically powerful in England. Then that didn't work. Then he tried to build a puzzle that would rival Rubik's Cube. And he promised everybody, this puzzle I've made is so great, it's for everybody. So it won't be solved by a mathematician and you can't use a computer. And I want everyone to buy it. So I'll give a pounds 1 million prize to the first solver. But I promise you, it could be a 9-year-old kid or it could be a 90-year-old grandmother in hospital, but it won't be a mathematician with a computer. And he had figured out it would take 3 years and the sales would make him wealthier than he was. And it was solved in 6 months by two Cambridge University
Wow.
mathematicians using their computer. And then after that, he brought his manifold skills to climate change.
A good story. Now, in the book you wrote that we tend to think of climate change as modern, but it's not really. When, in your research, when did it kind of first, when did talks of climate change first begin?
Well, this was something that I felt too, and I wonder if you felt this way about it. It seemed like, and this will be for people I think older than you, Allison, but it seemed like there were people with Birkenstocks who were going to Lollapalooza and Lilith Fair, and they were talking about this issue that maybe wasn't true while they were, eating sandwiches without cheese or eggs in them or meat in them. And then Al Gore won an Academy Award, and suddenly we had this thing with us. That was what I thought the history of climate change. Or God, Frank Luntz just tricked me into saying climate change. That's what I thought the history of global warming was. But in fact, it's always been an establishment idea. So 1824, Baron Fourier, Joseph Fourier, who was a French mathematician, he figured out that there must be some kind of a lid over the Earth that kept heat in when it came down, like sort of like a glass lid. This is where we got the image of the greenhouse. Let me give you a for instance. This is going to be a little planetary jump. Mars looks really hot, right? Like it looks like a desert. So we imagine it's hot. It's freezing. It's like 50 or 60 below because it doesn't have any carbon dioxide to keep heat in it, right? So the sun's rays hit the surface, they turn infrared, and then they just go back out. There's nothing that keeps them in. So what Fourier figured out in 1824, and he's one of the leading mathematicians of his era, was there must be something there. Then in 1859, a man named John Tyndall, who would become the director of the laboratories at the Royal Institution, so one of the leading scientists in Britain, he decided to figure out what it was. And I loved writing about him and researching him. It's only about 4 pages in the book for people who are nervous about reading climate scientist narratives, but it's actually sort of a great story. He was the first climber, or the fourth climber, up the Weisshorn, which is the second biggest of the Alps in Europe. He said he wrote about it as if he were mountain climbing. Experimented all day. The subject is completely in my hands. And he figured out that what was keeping the Earth's warmth on the planet, or the sun's warmth on Earth, were carbon dioxide and water vapor. And then in 1896, a Swedish scientist named Svante Arrhenius, he would become the first Swedish recipient of the Nobel, and he would direct the Nobel labs. He was the first person to do the math that said, okay, if you lowered carbon dioxide, we would slip back towards the ice ages, but if you doubled it, we would go up about 4 degrees Celsius. So that's the giant head start that we had. And then Arrhenius was from Sweden. He was excited about the fact that we would heat up the planet because it's cold there. And so some of his friends who were scientists who didn't want to wait, they wanted to take like old emptied out coal mines and start them on fire because there would still be some residue, and they figured the carbon would come out and it would begin to make Sweden more habitable. Arrhenius believed that even though there would be a lot more carbon dioxide, that the oceans would take it. And then Roger Revelle, just to bring us back to Time magazine in 1956, he was a specialist in water, and he realized, oh, no, no, no. Once the carbon dioxide is released from all of the coal and all the oil, it will go to the water, and then the water will evaporate it right back out. And so it will just begin to crowd the atmosphere. So we've known in our current form of knowledge since 1896, and you could argue almost 200 years. We're coming up on our 200th anniversary next year.
Right. But I agree with you. I think we do kind of think of it as a modern issue within the last few decades.
Can I add one of the other things that made me want to write the book? It was because the research was wild, just going into old newspapers. Cover of the New York Times in 1933, America in longest heating spell since the Revolutionary War. You know, the line has been going up for 25 years. And that headline, front part of the New York Times, was next to an article, just to give you a sense of how long this has been with us. It was next to an article of the Nazis saying, okay, we're not going to act badly anymore, 1933. And also next to an article saying, these speakeasies that Al Capone is running, we've got to put them out of business because it's leading to public disorder. So that's how far back.
Interesting. One part of the book that I thought was really interesting that you did very well, the historical part of how you covered the presidencies from Jimmy Carter all the way through Donald Trump, and how each of the administrations have handled global warming. Sorry, I said
it's hard. No, it's difficult. He's a
kidding.
genius, Merlin.
Right. So I thought it was interesting, just because some of these presidents were before I was around, but just looking at how they each kind of viewed global warming. Jimmy Carter wanted to see coal in power plants and all the furnaces. Ronald Reagan wanted to end intolerable dependence on foreign oil. George Bush kind of made me laugh. He nicknamed himself the environmentalist president. And even Obama, the two issues he focused on in his campaign were climate and healthcare. And then, of course, Donald Trump does not believe in global warming and actually removed the U.S. or withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Climate Treaty. But it's just kind of interesting to look at over the last few decades how a lot of the presidents had a plan for what they, projected to achieve in their administrations, and kind of where we got with it.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, it's a great story. It was, I love the Godfather movies, and it was like how the Godfather movies take us through the past into the present. It was like that because every president has had to deal with it.
Yeah.
And it was a great way to tell the story of our times, right? But through people dealing with this. Yeah. So Carter thought that it was just terrible luck. You get the impression that on some level, God doesn't really want an immediate solution to global warming because, for example, when the science matured in the late 70s, that was during this horrible energy crisis. And we have a lot of coal, and we also have a lot of bad ad writers. And so one of the slogans that was very popular in the 70s was, okay, the Saudis have oil, but America is the Saudi Arabia of coal. Let's dig it. It's just so embarrassing. So he wanted to dig it. He wanted us to be burning or to be mining 1 billion tons of coal a year. And he wanted it even to be made into fuel that we could put in our cars. And coal is the worst thing. It causes warming faster, basically, than heating oil or than petroleum. Then President Reagan I know a lot of people like him. He wasn't our best president for a lot of issues, and one of them was the environment. He just didn't believe any environmental stuff. And so, for example, the Department of Energy and the White House Council on Environmental Quality, they kept talking about climate change. We need to solve it. His solution was clever. Let's get rid of both those agencies. So this one, the head of the Council on Environmental Quality, which only exists to advise the president, he had released a report, or he had overseen a report that came out in '79. I think his name was Gus Speth. and he said he expected it to become very influential in government decision-making circles. He said government must start dealing with this problem immediately. That's 1979. And he was right about the influence. Within a year, President Reagan tried to close down the council. Then President Bush came in. It's funny, as you said, right? Like President Bush was an environmentalist president. That was the name he gave himself.
Mhm.
And he would have done something about it. His chief of staff just did not believe in global warming. And so when he wanted to make a speech in, I think, 91 or 90, saying, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to tackle this, and we could have sort of dealt with it fairly painlessly then. He ripped up the speech and then wrote a different speech, which the president delivered. It's not, though, just an issue for one side of the aisle. President Obama was really committed to the issue, and his chief of staff, a man named Rahm Emanuel, he felt that it was just too hard an issue for voters. And so he thought, look, we only want to do things that are successful. We're going to do healthcare. We're not going to do climate change. And when people asked him about climate change, he answered, the dolphins will be okay for another year.
So we talked about some of the key figures in the conversation of global warming. What are some of the names that stand out among the climate deniers?
Lord Christopher Monckton, he's the man who invented the eternity puzzle. That was the puzzle that was solved within 6 months by the two mathematicians, one of whom was one of the, I think, top 10 mathematicians in the world.
Is that what it was called, the eternity puzzle?
Yeah, and so they're great headline writers in the UK. And so one of the headlines was, "It only seemed like eternity," which I thought was great. So Monckton is very funny. I really like the story of a denier named Fred Singer, who came to America from Vienna. His real name is Siegfried, but he thought that wouldn't help in post-war America. So he came to America as someone already denying his own first name.
Interesting.
But they're all, like, every one of those people are funny, and it's thrilling and terrifying that they have thwarted both national policy and also international will. And Allison, do you remember what the number is? How many deniers? This is the number they give themselves for this super group that was able to delay action on this for 40 years.
No, I don't recall.
25, 24
Wow.
plus one. Shocking.
I didn't know I was going to be quizzed tonight.
By the way, your questions are totally excellent. So just what I thought was, holy God, she's a great reader.
So Fred Singer, he was one kind of that talked about junk science.
Yes,
Use the term junk science. What exactly is junk science, and how does that fall into
so one
global warming?
one of the fascinating, like, that's another one of those phrases that for people who do like the Leonardo DiCaprio movie the way I do, and like it more than Allison does, it was one of those ideas that they just wanted to put in all our pockets. And by they, the mood artists, right? Tobacco, many of the most prominent climate deniers, they were trained by the tobacco industry, who wanted to deny the fact. They knew before the scientists did that cigarettes caused lung cancer, but the real problem for them, they were able to survive that. The real problem was by the 70s, when it became clear that, Allison, if someone were smoking in the office that you were in, that would also give you lung cancer, bronchitis, et cetera, et cetera. So they had to have a strategy. They had to insert a way of thinking about science into people's brains that would make them not be angry at tobacco and then reject the science that was coming out of the EPA. And so they said, okay, we have to get people thinking about politics of science. They had these very devious meetings, but they also keep excellent records. So you can see how they arrived at their positions. Allison, that must have been funny. Like, they were very upfront. When they saw how bad things were going in the late 80s, they were like, can I use a mild PG-13 curse word? We are in
Yes.
deep S. We're in deep crap, is what they said. Like, they understood the bad spot they were in. And so they had this meeting for a weekend. We need to have all the best people for Philip Morris. We need a solution to this problem. And what they came up with is, we have to make science unreliable. And the problem was there wasn't a good phrase for it, like bad science. That sounds vague. We need a better term. And they kept having meetings, and they began to realize in the later 80s this was going to be their best solution. And then there was a writer who had come up with the phrase junk science, and they co-opted that phrase, and then they came up with a corollary, sound science. And the basic idea was if you just called something junk science, right? Like let's say, for example, you say it's 90 million miles to the moon, and we need spacesuits. You know, I could say, well, that sounds expensive, or I'm not sure. But if I say that's just junk science, then anyone listening would be like, maybe Allison's wrong. So they decided to put that idea into the ether. And the thinking was the EPA were the people who were saying that secondhand smoke, and God, the tobacco people are so good. They had their own name for it. Their name for secondhand smoke was environmental tobacco smoke.
Mm.
So it's just like the rocks and the valleys are just somehow releasing smoke that we're all inhaling. So they wanted to make people believe that the EPA, that their science was bad and was junk. And so if they could make people, if they could attack the science of climate, the science of global warming, damn you, Franklins, if they could make people believe that global warming wasn't real, then the EPA might also be wrong about secondhand smoke. And so they created this phrasing that's still used by reporters all the time today, junk science, sound science.
Yeah, I actually think the Philip Morris story was probably one of the most intriguing parts of the story to me. Like their whole mindset of like how they can change people's opinion about smoking. And you had that very interesting story about the British filmmaker that kind of came up with a documentary that Philip Morris bought into, thinking that they could expand into the
Yeah.
UK market. And here it ended up being, what was it called? Death in the
Death
West,
in
a
the West.
Marlboro
Yeah.
story. Because Marlboro, I think their campaign was that all cowboys smoke cigarettes. And in this documentary, they had 6 real life cowboys that were ropers and riders, and 5 of the 6 had lung cancer and 1 had emphysema. And in the documentary, they have um, him riding horseback with oxygen tanks and stuff. I was trying to see if that was on YouTube because it just sounded so interesting to me. I think I found it, but I wasn't sure if it was the right one or not. But it's I can remember even when I was younger seeing on TV. So I want to say it was Philip Morris. They had a television commercial with all previous smokers that had lung cancer or emphysema. It was at Christmas time singing Christmas carols in front of like the Philip Morris headquarters. Like it's just interesting to see how they kind of took something kind of like, oh, singing Christmas carols, but then it was kind of like the Marlboro story, how they took people that really did
Yeah.
buy into that smoking wasn't bad for you, and now look at me now.
Yeah.
Here I am with lung cancer. My life may end earlier than it should have.
One of the cowboys, I was very haunted by one of the cowboys, and I think there are 2 copies of it on YouTube. One of them is split into 4 segments, and then the other goes all the way through. But if you search Death in the West, the Marlboro story, it's about 28 minutes, I think,
Okay.
31 minutes. It's not.
Yep.
But one of them says, I grew up thinking that to be a man, you had to have a cigarette in your hand. I'm gonna die a young man.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay, then I did
and
find it because it was 31 minutes. I
yeah,
wasn't sure that was the right one.
But yeah, that those and Philip Morris, they're so ingenious. They are professionals at changing opinions. They didn't debate whether their cigarettes cause cancer. They didn't debate whether it was a smart move or not to start to pick up cigarettes when you're 14 or 15.
Mhm.
Remember what they debated? They debated whether or not the 6 people really qualified as cowboys.
Right, right.
So yeah, it was a great story to tell because there was always just something. It was like that novel Catch 22, but real.
Hmm. So the last thing I wanted to ask you about, and then we'll take some audience questions. At the end of the book, you talked a little bit about something called Climategate, a term that was popularized by James Delingpole, and of course with the Freedom of Information Act. What was Climategate for those of us like To be honest, I hadn't heard the term before. Tell us a little bit about Climategate.
So Climategate was it was the culmination of a lot of the brilliant brilliant rearguard actions against climate science from about 92 on. So in 1988, in the spring, well, actually 2 days into summer of 1988, the second great American climate scientist, a man named Jim Hansen, who I think of as kind of a hero. Everyone else, scientists are very cautious. That's another thing that people like Philip Morris and the deniers have made us forget or try to change our opinion about. It's very hard to get them to say something is going to happen or something won't happen. And so it had been very clear to most atmospheric scientists that this is just how carbon dioxide works, but nobody was willing to go on the record and say this is happening now. And Hansen was willing to do it. He said the reason he did it was he didn't want his grandkids to say grandpa knew it was coming, but he never made it clear. So in a stifling hearing room in, I think, Dirksen 351 in the Senate office building, June 23rd, 1988, he said, the greenhouse effect has been detected and it is it is warming our climate now. So within 4 years, within 3 years, the coal industry said, okay, this is a game-ending kind of issue for the American coal-fired electricity industry. So they had these position papers, same as the Philip Morris people did. We have to reposition global warming as theory rather than fact. And that was where everything kind of began. And by the fall of 2009, their approach had become mature and they found a way using freedom of information to make it seem as if the climate scientists had been lying all along. And the basic way they did it was by taking, it must be tempting if you get emails from people you don't like, you can take part of the email and then combine it with another part. And so there was one great phrase that someone hacked. There are three places where the temperature record is kept. One of the three is, one's in DC, NOAA. The other, NASA, is in New York, and then the third is at the University of East Anglia. And they hacked that one, and they got all these emails from client scientists. And there was one from 1998 which said, "I've done Professor Mann's nature trick, which I can then use to hide the decline." And what they actually meant was that the results from tree rings. Sorry to get all sciencey for a second, but do you know how tree rings show how old trees are? They can also show how healthy they are, so how they're being affected by their climate, basically. And for some reason, after about 1960, they decline in usefulness. So the email had been about how to not show that their usefulness declines after 1960. And so in the chart that these scientists were making, they just substituted just the real temperature record. However, the sentence that came out once people had kind of cut different parts together was, "I've used this trick to hide the decline." And then they pretended it meant to hide a decline in temperatures. What was even funnier was 1998 was the warmest year in recorded history. So 1999 is when the letter comes from. So if anybody had thought about it, they would have thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. But instead, it was a great story and everybody reported on it. Everyone went crazy on it for about a year. And the New York Times said, there's been a total reversal. This is a paraphrase, and this is a direct quote. "Now the foes of climate action have the ball." And so all of a sudden, these deniers who had looked sometimes silly and sometimes mercenary could now walk on CNN and look very serious and say, "We were right all along. We're the heroes."
Okay, well, is there anything else you want to talk about before we take some audience questions?
Yes, one last thing before we do, which is look, you've said everything I would have wanted to say. I began with the inventors because we're a great country, and we were able to go from not having electricity to having lights and vacuum cleaners and electric heating in most homes in about a generation. It was the Department of Energy that President Reagan wasn't able to get away with, said that it was the fastest adoption of a new technology probably in human history. And I love beginning the story with these great histories of Edison and his rival and first friend, Nikola Tesla, because we are a wonderful country, and I have faith that during using that same ingenuity, we will find a way to solve this and put it behind us and digital, and then look at it as a great story that we lived for 70 years.
Thank you. So we have a couple questions in the Q&A. Remember, you can put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat. Our first question here is from Edward. He asked, can the significant current increase in the release of methane be a side effect of burning fossil fuels be linked?
Yes, and here's the reason why. Essentially, it's in the permafrost, and this has been a fear. So, and who's I didn't hear the name of the person whose
Edward.
question that is. Oh, Edward. So it's a great question, and Edward, in my research, sometimes when things made me feel really upset, I would like put exclamation marks. But when I began reading about the prospective methane release, I just wrote like that it was extremely unnerving. Methane traps heat even more effectively than carbon dioxide, and methane is just generated from decomposing vegetative matter. So it is like, let's say the grass and trees, et cetera, that are in the permafrost. Allison, do you know what, excuse me, do you know what permafrost is?
Mhm.
I learned it during this book, so my hat's off to you. But a lot of permafrost in Siberia and Alaska. And as it heats up because of climate warming, it begins to release methane, and methane is way better. I think it's like 4 or 5 times more effective at trapping heat than carbon dioxide, which then makes the warming go faster, which then would release more methane, which then makes it go even faster. So if we have a huge release of methane all at once, it is very scary. So I think, Edward, the way I felt when I first read about that was, I think I wrote in very small letters, ball game, just for better or worse. So again, we're a great country and we can invent our way out of things, but that one was very disturbing to read about.
Jules asked, I think global warming is too mild. How do you feel about the term global heating?
I think it's great. Heating and warming. I think we also, as a people, we just like to name things when they're like socks and like the heels go out on a word, and so we like to replace it. If we had said global heating for years and then someone said global heating is too mild, let's go with global warming, we'd all be like, yeah, I think just we like to have new names. Um, I think you could make a case that that makes people look at things afresh. So yeah, I think global heating is great. For a while, they were talking, some climate scientists and climate communicators were talking about using global weirding, because one of the things is it just leads to odder weather, and it doesn't only lead to heating, as Jules was saying. It also will lead to it increases the odds of flash flooding, and it increases the odds of weird sort of blizzarding. And so global weirding was a way of expressing that. But that was like in Mean Girls, when they can't make fetch happen, they really couldn't make global weirding happen.
Um, I don't know if you're going to answer this question because I know you waited until the end of the book to reveal why you called the book The Parrot in the Igloo, but Diane wanted to know, tell me about the choice of Parrot in Igloo in your title.
I just thought it was fun for the reader to find out towards the end. So 1956, like in the 50s, um, people had been noticing the climate changing. It has been with us for a long time. So like the New York Times ran like more than half a dozen pieces in the first years of the 50s saying, is the climate changing? It was like watching a brilliant person argue with themselves, turning in circles. Is the climate changing? No, the climate isn't changing. Could the climate change? Yes, the climate is changing. Old timers may be right when they tell us climate is changing. How industry can change climate, and then finally, yes, the climate is really changing. And in October of 1956, the same year that Time magazine had Roger Revelle saying in 50 years, this process could have a violent effect on our climate. So 2006, the Times interviewed another one of our early foundational climate scientists, a man named Gilbert Plass. And the Times summarized what he thought would happen in the very far future, like, a millennia from 1956. and the poles could be, this is the Times paraphrasing him, the poles could be converted to tropical jungles with tigers roaming in the underbrush and gaudy parrots squawking from the trees. And then by 2000, early 2010, in the middle of Climategate, when the opponents of climate action had the ball, in the great phrasing of the New York Times then, the leading denial senator, a man named James Inhofe, with a great middle name, James Mountain Inhofe. There was a freak blizzard on the mall in DC, and his family, rolled together an igloo out of snowballs, right? Just rolling bigger and bigger snowballs. And they plunked two signs on it. One said Al Gore's new home, and the other said honk if you heart global warming. And so the story is how we went from a parrot to an igloo. That's
Yeah,
a
and I
great
will,
question, Diane. Thank you.
yeah. I know you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but I love the cover of the book. I don't know if you had any input in it, but it is quite beautiful. I love it.
Thank you, Allison. No, we were thrilled when it came in.
Yeah,
Yeah, I thought it was incredibly pretty too.
yeah. Um, okay, our next question is from Jill, and she asked, what do you attribute the more recent denial of science, whether it's climate change or vaccines?
Um, there's been a lot of talk about that. Um, you could argue that that is the long-term effect of Philip Morris deciding that it was in their financial interests to make us begin to mistrust scientists. Um, Frank Luntz, what he said, the thinking that from the Merlin of the Republican Party is we have to get our own scientists, and that's who the deniers were. But this other solution was better. It was just make the public unwilling to trust any scientist. And that, like a lot of things that we do as people, we do this in our social lives, in our family lives, our emotional lives too. Short-term benefit, long-term drawback. But you could make it seem, and this is what people begin saying at the end of the book, after Climategate, at the end of the Climategate chapter, is that you've made science seem like another interest group, basically. And so that gives people the chance to say, oh, that's just the kind of thing scientists say. So now many people, as we saw with COVID, if they find what scientists are saying inconvenient, they just say, oh, you can't trust scientists. That is the result of 30 years or 40 years of the best political and advertising thinking.
Um, Mary asked, is most denial related to loss in revenue from businesses or even taxes from gas taxes? She said, for
Um,
example, Ohio charges an extra fee for having a hybrid or electric car.
so I don't understand the question. I was thinking about what a great question Joel's was. So you have to say that again, please.
Is most denial related to loss in revenue from businesses or even
Basically, yeah,
taxes from
brilliant.
gas?
That's brilliant. Yes. In a very direct way. So what the first generation of people who reported on this, what they said, which is also diabolical. And again, this is something that I notice myself doing sometimes, and that I notice colleagues of mine doing, and that family members do. The idea was never to win, was the phrase that you keep noticing in histories of this issue. It was just to keep the argument going. That was the way tobacco saw it, and that was the way the fossil fuel industry saw it. So let's say, for example, you want to go somewhere for the summer. Where do people go for the summer around Hudson? I mean, Hudson looks beautiful, so maybe people just stay in Hudson, but is there somewhere people like to go?
I don't know about the summer, but I know in the winter we get a lot of people that want to go somewhere warm.
Okay, great. So but let's say that you don't want to do it. Let's say that you want to save the money for something else. You don't want to say no because the people who you're talking about it with will be angry at you. So you just say, okay, let's keep studying the issue. Let's keep talking about it. And then you look up and it's too late to make the reservations. But meanwhile, you got all the benefits of going from January, through the next January without going on vacation. Um, if you could keep asking people, Mary, to do more research, while they're doing the research, you are selling the product. You are selling cigarettes for an extra, 70 or 80 years. By the 40s is when the cigarette companies knew. With coal, if you can keep selling coal from the late 70s to now, you have every year that you haven't regulated it, you are making more money. And when you get into gasoline and oil, that is hundreds of millions of dollars a year. a
Okay.
great question also.
Linda asked, many meteorologists deny global warming, arguing that we are experiencing normal cycles in weather. Is this junk science?
Linda, that's a great question. I just don't want to use that term just because I know too much of. If you ever pick up the book, Linda, you'll see from the chapter why I wouldn't want to call it junk science. But no, it's like, yes, there are there are things called Milankovitch cycles, which go about 80 or 100,000 years. But that would be like saying, because bodies go from anywhere, they last anywhere from 0 years to 110 years. Since the body is going to die anyway, why would you offer it medical attention? Right? We could fix this person's broken wrist or their broken ankle. But if you look at it over 40 or 50-year time cycles, that body isn't going to be walking around a century from now. So why should we do anything with it? Yes, climate has always changed. This is an astonishingly rapid change. It's measurable. We've never had the kinds of swings that we've had in temperature that we've had, as it turns out, since about 1820. So yes, climate is always changing. And in addition, we have pumped in, I think, about 25% more carbon dioxide so far. And it has matched all the predictions that scientists began making in the 1890s as to how quickly it would begin to heat things up.
Okay. Susan asked,
Also, a great question.
we always get great questions from our audience. That's why we always encourage them. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Susan asked, I was expecting to hear how oil companies have influenced politicians and also influenced the societal discussion.
So yeah, that's what we were talking about with Linda's question. They supported, they have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on this issue, their own scientists, and not in secret places. On the cover of the New York Times, they said that by the mid 90s, they had reported to their employers that the science was well established and could not be denied. And then in long retrospect, the head of the research program for something called the Global Climate Coalition said that, and I think he was himself in his day job was a scientist for Exxon. He said that he had tried without success to make his employers see scientific reality. Yeah, but it's not just, it isn't, the oil companies will do what they're enabled to do by lawmakers. And one thing that I love that you asked this question because it allowed me to tell this thing, which is another reason why I wrote the book. In the late 70s, those scientists, and in this case, it was a group called the Jason Committee. Have you seen, Allison, have you seen Oppenheimer?
No.
I haven't seen it yet either. But that's the Manhattan Project. Scientists got
Okay.
together because we had to resist European fascism. And the Manhattan Project, those scientists brought us radar and the atomic bomb. When the war was over, they reformed in the 50s as what's called Jason. And they are the best physicists and they advise the defense community. And in the 70s, this is around that time when all the science came to maturity, they also reported to the White House that this was going to happen. And so some of them went to brief lawmakers, and the lawmakers, this is, let's say, summer of 79. The lawmaker said, well, when is this all going to happen? And the scientists said, give or take 40 years. And the lawmaker said, get back to us in 39.
Okay, we have two questions left and then we'll wrap up for the evening here. Edward asked, what will we be doing to survive climate in 2050?
It depends on what we do now. What they think, and a lot of climate scientists and then climate communicators go back and forth on how doomy to make it sound. If you pick up the book towards the end, there's a scientist who received the Nobel. He's from Stanford. His name is Dr. Chu, Samuel Chu. He was director of energy under President Obama, and he is the first Nobel laureate to serve in a cabinet. And if you don't pick up the book, you can just find like a 70-minute speech that he gave at Stanford to the Stanford Business School. I think it's in 2013. And he's just very forthright, and he looks at it like it's not going to be awful it'll just be very bad. It'll be really unpleasant. It'll be like when it's 95 degrees or 100 degrees or 105, and it seems like it's pressing and it seems like it's awful. And then by October or November, we forget. And that will be super unpleasant. And then we'll come back around. What he also said is that if it heats, if we lose control of it more and we get to where we heat up, that's if we get, let's say, 3 to 5 degrees warmer. If we get from 4 to 6 degrees warmer, his phrase was great. He said it's non-adaptable bad, which means that things stop growing. So the people go back and forth on how direct they want to be about it. I think we're very resilient. I think that we will find a way out of it. And one thing we're likely to do is that if it begins to get really bad, there is a fail-safe, which is to release what is effectively a layer of smog into the stratosphere, sulfur dioxide particles. Do you remember this from the early part of the book, Allison?
Yes.
And so that would cool us down for a year. So I imagine that there's a chance that we'll have tried that by 2050. Also a great question.
Yeah, I think the final question we have from Lee kind of wraps into that one too. Or you kind of answered it in Edward's question there. I'm sorry, I lost the question. Hold on.
Yeah.
Where did it go? Is your opinion that, I'm sorry, is it your opinion that global warming and climate change will end well for our future?
Yeah, I think we're resilient. I would be curious to ask Lee what his or her sense. I just couldn't tell. It's a non-gender normative name.
Right.
But I'm curious what their sense of it is. I think there is something we didn't do great with the issue because we had such a head start. And so there's that almost fairy tale part of us which wants to see a punishment for it. Like, we should have known better. We have had 70 years to prepare for this. We did nothing. Now we have the weather that we have now. And there's some part of it that's like, we deserve it. But children don't deserve it. And the people, I sort of began to think, just because I didn't like the way President Reagan began to borrow huge amounts of money from future Americans, we've been borrowing weather from future generations of America, right? Like for future generations of Americans and other people on the planet. We have been burning fuel, which is a cheap way to travel places on vacation and to go places faster than we did in the 19th century. But every time we did that, after a certain point, we realized that in a way we were taking mild winters, and we were taking sort of mild winters and not overheated summers that people might have enjoyed in 2030 and 2040, and we were burning them up now. So it is sort of nice in the fairy tale punishment oriented parts of our brains to say, now we must suffer. I like to think that we will, first off, I have faith in American science, and a lot of American scientists believe if we change to nuclear, that in fact that will be a solution. But the second thing is, I think Americans, up until very recently, what a lot of green campaigners who did tremendous work over the last 40 years on this issue, they felt that Americans wouldn't sacrifice, and the most you could ask them to do was to change their light bulbs. That's why that was a fun chapter to write. But everyone complained during COVID, and I know there were a lot of bad feelings about that time, but what I saw was that you could ask Americans to totally change their way of life, and you could ask them in early February, and by mid-February, they would all do it, and they would all do it for 2 years. And so I think that there's some part of us that likes hard tasks, and that if it's required of us to make some sacrifice for 1 year, 4 years, 10 years, I feel we could all do it if we understood what the rewards would be. And the rewards were a non-adaptable bad world, in Dr. Chu's phrasing, for all of us.
All right. Well, Lee did follow up, and they said, combined with other global calamities, I don't believe that things will go well, but then I'm basically a pessimist.
Lee, I join you in pessimism, but just looking, there's a great thing that David Hume, the philosopher David Hume, said. He said that we should never have great faith, and this is not entirely positive. We should never have great faith in the future. For example, just because the sun has risen every day doesn't mean that it will rise tomorrow. So, Lee, that's the shared pessimism you and I share with David Hume. But on the other hand, just looking at what we've been able to do both as a people, as Americans, and then also as a modern people technologically, I feel that there's some combination of technological solutions and lifestyle changes that will bring this problem to heal. But Lee, let's contact each other through the library in 2040 and see which one of us is right.
Well, thank you so much, David Lipsky, for your time tonight. And thank you for all of our viewers tonight that stay tuned into our virtual program. Of course, we have copies available for purchase through the Learned Owl of the Parrot and the Igloo. If you'd like to get your copy, the link is still in the chat. And I will say thank you all so much. And David Lipsky, have a good evening.
Thanks, you too. It was great. It was a great hour. Thanks for the great questions,
Yeah.
and thanks for the great hosting, Allison. That was wonderful.
Thank
See
you
you.
so much. Good night, everyone.